Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Summer at Fairacre. Chapter 2, Minor Irritations. Much to my annoyance, I found that I could not sleep after Mr. Maughan's visit. I had forgotten to put my hot water bottle in bed, disturbed from my comfortable routine by my guest, and this may have been the reason for my unusual wakefulness. After tossing and turning for 2 or 3 hours, I realized that I was ravenously hungry and decided to go downstairs for sustenance. While some milk was heating on the stove, I collected an assortment of goodies on a tray. What, I thought, would a dietitian make of a banana, a digestive biscuit, and a spoonful of stewed prunes? It should keep me going until breakfast time, anyway. It was unusually quiet in the kitchen at 1 o'clock in the morning. Moonlight had been flooding in when I entered it, silvering the plates in the rack over the sink and throwing squares of light over the brick floor. In the distance I could hear the wavering cry of an owl, and I stood relishing this rare nighttime beauty before switching on the electric light and turning all to prosaic normality. For years Fairacre had been without the boon of electricity. When it finally was brought into the schoolhouse, I welcomed it rapturously and never ceased to marvel at the transformation it has made to my everyday living. Nevertheless, it is good to be reminded now and again, as in those few silent moonlit minutes, of how things were when I first came to live here, and how they had been for generations of Fairacre folk before me. I carried my bounty back to bed and enjoyed it whilst reading my ever-present bedside book, The Diary of a Country Parson. This good man of the 18th century never fails to amuse, teach, and enchant me. I felt quite abstemious about my modest trayful as I read that for a dinner on November 24th, 1795, Parson Woodford enjoyed hashed calf's head, a boiled chicken and some bacon, a leg of mutton roasted, and a Norfolk batter pudding and drippings. After that we had a duck roasted, macaroni and tarts. By way of dessert we had white currants, pears and apples, and filberts. In February of the next year he gave to an old decayed fisherman OIO. This was 1 shilling. He goes on to remark, "He was the man that brought me once some very indifferent sprats." This last entry made me laugh so much that I finished my snack, switched off my ever-blessed bedside lamp, and was asleep in 10 minutes. Before school the next morning, I was alarmed to see that Mrs. Pringle's limp was much in evidence. What could have happened? Had I inadvertently spilt something viscous, such as red ink, on her immaculate floorboards? Had the sink overflowed, the plug stopped up with that cursed ubiquitous bubble gum, beloved of Fairacre children? Had the stove gone out? All these hazards flashed before me like the drowning man's swift summary of his life, or so we are told. Luckily, for once it was not my fault that Mrs. Pringle's leg had seen fit to flare up. As had happened many times before, the cause of her discomfort was her niece, Minnie Pringle. Minnie's IQ is extremely low. She cannot read, has difficulty in signing her name, and is virtually incapable of doing the simplest work, as I know to my cost. In a weak moment once I let her help in my house, and it would need a stronger pen than mine and far more time than I could spare to catalogue the appalling list of damages she managed to inflict. I will give just 2 instances. She thought that a cushion cover looked grubby and put it to soak, complete with its contents, into neat bleach in the sink. I must say in all fairness that the sink had never looked so pristine, although the smell in the kitchen was enough to choke one. Her second effort was to dismantle the electric cooker in order to give it a good going over. Fortunately, Mrs. Pringle arrived in time to switch off the current at the main, or doubtless I should have found Minnie electrocuted on the kitchen floor amidst the debris. It took Mr. Willett and me all the evening to put the thing together again, and I have never heard so many whispered curses from that upright churchman on any other occasion. This time, it appeared, Minnie had been obliged to take one of her children to hospital, and had deposited the rest with Mrs. Pringle at a moment's notice. "Called in as bold as brass with them 4 little varmints, just as I was getting down to the kitchen floor a nice washover with some suds I had left over from rinsing out the tea-cloths." "What happened to the 5th?" Minnie's children are by a variety of fathers. True, she is married, not all that long ago, but that is to an elderly man called Ern with children of his own. The marriage is a stormy one, which is hardly surprising, and Bert, an earlier paramour, always seemed to be bobbing up and distracting Minnie's scatterbrained attention from her wifely duties. "Well, Ern went up to the Potters to see if the lawnmower was in good nick for the summer, and he took young Basil with him. Don't ask me why." I had no intention of asking, especially as it was almost time to let in the children, and Miss Briggs, my assistant, was hovering around as if waiting for something. "Anyway, Ern left the thing running while he went for the oil can, and the little faggot put his hand in, took the tops off 3 fingers. Oh, no! Oh, yes, and that stupid Ern and Minnie hadn't got the plain common sense to take the tops with them to the hospital to be sewn on again." Miss Briggs emitted a small yelp. I sat down quickly in my chair and concentrated my attention on a rather wispy late hyacinth growing over water. I cannot take gory details, and Mrs. Pringle spares absolutely nothing. "I think it's time for the bell," I said cravenly to Miss Briggs. She hurried away. And don't tell me any more," I begged Mrs. Pringle. "Not about the injuries, I mean. I'm very sorry for the child. Is he staying in hospital long?" "No, more's the pity. Minnie gets him this afternoon, and I've said they can all have tea with me, and she can take him home straight to bed." "Well, that's very good of you," I said. "You must be a tower of strength to that little family." A horrid thought struck me. "You're not thinking of keeping any of the school-age ones with you? This has happened in the past, and of course they attend my school temporarily, and a sore trial they are." "Not likely," said my cleaner succinctly. She rose from the front desk and made her way to the lobby. I think my tribute to her had pleased her. Her limp had vanished. At playtime, while the children swarmed happily outside, Miss Briggs broached the subject which she had been trying to bring to my notice without success, as Mrs. Pringle's horrendous account of young Basil's mishap was then in spate. She had been engaged to a cheerful young builder called Wayne for some time now. He was working for Reg Thorne, a local builder, when he replaced our leaking skylight, not altogether successfully, as is becoming apparent, and that is how the 2 young people first met. The wedding is planned for the summer, soon after the end of the school year, and Miss Briggs' urgent problem was the fitting of her wedding dress. Could she possibly, she implored me, go half an hour earlier tomorrow to go to the dressmaker in Caxley, who had just heard that she must go into hospital and wanted to make a start on the dress before she took to her hospital bed? "That's no problem," I assured her. "The whole school can play fox and geese and grandmother's steps, and I sent a letter to my love. We don't get enough games altogether." "It might rain," she said anxiously. "I can still read," I told her. She returned to her class much relieved, and I remembered her early days with me when I had been obliged to point out to her that it was her duty to remain until all the infants were accounted for at the end of the afternoon, and the fact that the clock said 3:30 was not the signal for instant departure. She had improved considerably, whether mellowed by love or simply by discovering that she could do her job quite well was a matter of conjecture. Mr. Willett's summing up had been that she was a fair old lump of a girl when she first arrived at Fairacre. It had been difficult to talk to her, and I had found her downright surly at times. However, we now hit it off very well, and I thought that Wayne's influence had been all to the good. She proposed to continue teaching after her marriage, and for this I was grateful. New appointments are always hazardous, and in a 2-teacher school such as ours, it is absolutely essential that the pair can work happily together. Of course, I pondered, there might be babies coming along, but she could always have maternity leave and then come back if she wanted to. It then occurred to me that, as usual, I was allowing my mind to run well ahead. After all, we had not had the wedding dress fitted yet. It was rather early to be counting chicks. Furthermore, through the lofty windows, I could see a row of moving heads. Obviously, a procession of children was running along the coke pile, and it was high time that that little caper was stopped. Seizing the handbell, I made my way into the playground. That afternoon, the first mild breeze began to blow. The weather vane on St. Patrick's steeple had veered to the southwest, the clouds scudded along at a merry rate, and here and there the sunshine broke through, gilding the bare branches and raising our spirits. Could spring be here at last? The children sniffed the air as appreciatively as eager dogs out on a walk, and I let them go play 5 minutes earlier than usual, although with stern threats about the consequences of going near, let alone on, the coke pile. When I went to call them in, I saw that Gerald Partridge, our much-loved vicar, was among the crowd, his venerable cape green with age billowing from his shoulders in the breeze. "My dear Miss Reed," he said, clasping my hands in his. The leopard-skin gloves of winter were not in evidence today, a sure sign the weather was warmer. "Come into the school," I said. No, it's so lovely to welcome a mild breeze. Let us enjoy the air out here. I've brought a letter from my wife. No need to answer it immediately. You may want to consider your reply. That's why she decided not to telephone you." "What's it about?" I asked, alarm raising its ugly head. Was another pot of marmalade needed for some good cause? Was I being invited to one of Mrs. Partridge's cheese and wine parties to meet some eminent divine? If so, a simple telephone call had always been considered fitting, so what hidden complications were inside the envelope? "Look at it in the peace of your own home," advised the vicar. Perhaps my consternation was writ large upon my face. In any case, Gerald Partridge, though vague in many ways, is remarkably sensitive to other people's feelings. I stuffed it into my jacket pocket. "I always think," said the vicar, changing the subject with aplomb, "that you have one of the finest views in Fairacre." He gazed across Mr. Robert's young corn to the massive bulk of the downs on the skyline. "So do I told him. "I will lift up my eyes unto the hills from whence cometh my help," quoted Mr. Partridge. "You know, I find them as much comfort as the psalmist did. They put our own petty affairs into perspective." "Absolutely," I agreed, "like ducks." "Ducks?" "From troubles of the world I turn to ducks, beautiful comical things, sleeping or curled, the rest escapes me, but I'll look it up for you." "I should appreciate that," said the vicar gravely. "Ducks or downs, we all need to gather comfort where we can, and I find a great deal in remembering fragments of writing." A breathless 5-year-old rushed up to us. "Miss, one of them Coggs kids has been to the lavatory on the lobby floor." "That," I told her, "is what is known as a contradiction of terms, but I'll come at once." "In that case," said the vicar, "I must let you return to your duties." He departed, I thought, with unnecessary haste, and I went to find the floor-cloth. What with one thing and another, I had forgotten Mrs. Partridge's missive until I was rummaging for a handkerchief in my jacket pocket whilst waiting for the kettle to boil in my peaceful kitchen. Out fell the envelope, and up surged my misgivings again. I read it while I sipped my tea. After suitable greetings, the letter continued, "My dear friend Hazel Smith is trying to raise some money for the Save the Children Fund in Caxley, and is organizing an evening meeting which is going to be billed as Our Children. She is asking several speakers to say a few words and then to answer questions from the floor. I know she has a local magistrate who will talk about the juvenile court, and a most eminent educationalist, as well as a local doctor who specializes in children's ailments. A pediatrician, I believe is the correct word, unless I'm confusing it with something to do with feet, or even worse. But a very nice man indeed, who was once on TV in one of those upsetting medical series. I took the liberty of mentioning your name to her, and she may get in touch with you to see if you would be a member of the panel. Perhaps you could talk on young children in school, or children's literature. Anyway, I do so hope you don't mind my mentioning you to her. You would be so good, and I know you would love Hazel. There would be a cold buffet and wine after the meeting and a chance to get to know a great many people who are really caring about the young, just as you are. She was mine affectionately after 3 pages. "Oh, Lor, Tibby," I said to the cat, "what do I do now?" But that unfeeling animal continued to wash his face vigorously, callous to the sufferings of his mistress. With this awful prospect before me, I spent the evening in a fine state of dithering. My first instinct was to turn down the proposal with a flat refusal. I had no wish to turn out for an evening in Caxley, and a downright antipathy to my unknown panel members. They were probably all as charming as Mrs. Partridge's old friend Hazel. They certainly appeared to be much more public-spirited, unless of course they'd been coerced into it and were feeling quite as reluctant as I was myself. But I see far too much of people who care for the young, and on the whole I find them exhaustingly earnest. I know I care for the young. Look at the floor-cloth interlude only that afternoon. You can't get much nearer the bone for caring than that. Nevertheless, the thought of answering a lot of solemn questions about possible damage done to a young child's ego by thwarting it of some simple pleasure such as flooding the bathroom or jumping on the cat filled me with horror. Besides, what should I talk about? Even 10 minutes speaking takes a devil a lot of writing, and I know my limits. No, I should have to decline. Having decided this, I then remembered the many kindnesses that Mrs. Partridge had shown to me in the school, and began to feel a mean-spirited wretch. Would it hurt me to give up one evening? Yes, squeaked my baser self. Mrs. Partridge must consider me capable of the job, or I shouldn't have been asked. Probably the 17th person on her list, all the others having sensibly made plans to go abroad or have visitors or contract shingles and so on. It would be letting down dear Mrs. Partridge if I fobbed off Hazel Fomingy with some weak excuse. At that moment the telephone bell rang, and I jumped as though I had been shot. This must be it. Well, better answer it and be guarded. Ask if I might ring her tomorrow when I've thought it over. I gave my number in a cracked voice. To my enormous relief, it was Amy. "Have you got a cold?" she asked solicitously. I babbled out my present problems, and Amy forbore to laugh, at least out loud. "What a funny old thing you are," she commented in such a loving voice I very nearly burst into tears. "You give the impression of being in command of every situation. Surely not. And yet you go all to pieces over a simple little matter like this." "But it isn't a simple little matter, Amy," I wailed. "It scares me stiff, the whole idea, and yet I'm so fond of Mrs. Partridge. I really don't want to hurt her by appearing disobliging, and of course it's a very good cause, saving the children, I mean. Why, come to think of it, I spend my whole life saving children." I told her the sad tale of the floor-cloth. "I should think that is evading Mrs. Pringle's wrath rather than saving children," commented Amy shrewdly. "But do you know what I'd do?" "No, tell me quickly," I urged. "Forget it for this evening. Go to bed early with a nice juicy book to read. 10 chances to 1 you'll know your own mind in the morning." "Thank you, Amy," I said humbly, and put down the receiver. Within a minute the telephone rang again. It was Amy. "Don't be so swift putting the phone back," she said. "I didn't have a chance to tell you why I was ringing." I apologized. "I just wondered if you'd decided on any of the Caxley Festival items. I ought to start booking, I think." "Amy," I began, "I'm afraid I haven't got around to—" "Never mind, never mind. Just tuck it away in your subconscious with Mrs. Partridge's proposition, and you can deal with both tomorrow." It was her turn to replace the receiver. Her tone had been kindly and forgiving, and I returned to my fireside, thanking the gods for the good friends whom I hardly seemed to deserve. Chapter 3. Henry Maughan Needs Company. After a solid night of sleep, I felt robust enough to accede to Mrs. Partridge's proposal, and decided to telephone after school that day to say how delighted I should be if her friend Hazel needed my services on the panel. Really, civilization has a lot to answer for. What would happen if we all spoke the unvarnished truth? As my egg boiled that morning, I turned March over on the wall calendar and read the new motto. It said, "A man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for?" Could this refer to my brave decision? Should I find myself the most knowledgeable member of the panel on that fateful night? Would the Caxley Chronicle have a paragraph about the brilliance of repartee, breadth of knowledge, personal charm, and, of course, innate modesty of the head teacher of Fairacre School? Fame could go no higher. While I dallied with this daydream, I noticed two things. This was April Fool's Day, so I must be on my guard in school this morning, and my egg had cracked and was fizzing all over the stove. When I came to eat it, I found predictably enough that it was hard-boiled. Not that I minded. To me, an egg is an egg however it turns up, but I am always amused to hear people say scathingly that they know someone who couldn't boil an egg, as though this act of cookery is the simplest thing imaginable. Strangely enough, it is jolly difficult to get an egg with a firm white and delectably moist yolk. It all depends on size, freshness, thickness of shell, and naturally on the accuracy of the egg timer or clock. Being called to the telephone does not help either, as I know to my cost. Well, now, I wondered as I spooned mine down, what little tricks would my naughty children have been up to? One April Fool's Day, I had managed to stop them from tying a rope just above floor level at the lobby door. Their victim would then have been Mrs. Pringle, without doubt, and the consequences not in the least humorous, as I pointed out to them. A little clean fun is one thing, injury to people was another. They were suitably chastened, and since then have found minor ways of celebrating the day. At first sight, all seemed as usual in the schoolroom. I opened my desk, alert to find a mammoth spider or even a grass snake, but there was nothing of that nature there. My chair had no drawing pin or blob of glue on it. The piano keys were clean, the hymn book unsullied. Their little jokes are usually perpetrated in the first half hour at school. Could they have forgotten? After 12 o'clock, the magic was supposed to have vanished, and any larking about was reckoned invalid by ancient tradition. We plowed gently on through arithmetic and reading. Playtime passed without incident, and I had quite forgotten to be on my guard, as no doubt my wily flock had intended. At 20 to 12, before the dinner lady arrived, I set them to copy Robert Bridges' adorable poem, "Spring Goeth All in White," from the blackboard. This was to be a combined exercise in learning a poem and engaging their skills in handwriting. It was while I was concentrating on my own fair hand, as I wrote the last two lines, that Ernest's voice rang out with horrid urgency. "Miss, quick! Patrick's fainted!" This has happened before, so that I dropped the chalk and was at Patrick's side in 1 second flat. The child had his head on the desk, and I was bent to attend to him when the roar of delight nearly raised the roof. "April Fool, miss! You're April Fool!" Patrick rose up, rosy with health and mirth, and I joined in the general hilarity. It seems to me, remembering the rope in the lobby, the odd spider, and stickiness, that I'd got off lightly this year. And we'll continue into April and find out what Mr. Maughan's problem is next time.